Good afternoon, everyone. As people get into the room, my name is Dr. Eric Turing. I'm the Senior Vice President for the American College of Veterinary Preventive Medicine, and I want to welcome you today to our webinar. Today's webinar is sponsored by the American College of Veterinary Preventive Medicine and is available to diplomates of the ACVPM, candidates, exam candidates of the ACVPM, and active members of the National Association of Federal Veterinarians, the American Association of Food Safety and Public Health Veterinarians, and the U.S. Animal Health Association. So with that, I will now turn it over to our ACVPM Continuing Education Committee representative, Dr. Kaylee Pettit, so she can introduce our speakers for today. Kaylee?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending. I'd like to introduce Dr. Colleen Duncan and Dr. Will Sander. First off, Dr. Colleen Duncan is a faculty veterinarian in the College of Veterinary Medicine and Biomedical Sciences at Colorado State University. Specialized in preventative medicine and anatomic pathology, she is particularly interested in how the environment influences the health of animals and people. Colleen completed her DVM and epidemiology masters at the Western College of Veterinary Medicine, followed by an anatomic pathology residency and epidemiology PhD at Colorado State University. Along with her is Dr. Will Sander, an assistant professor for preventative medicine and public health and director of the DVM MPH Joint Degree Program at the University of Illinois College of Veterinary Medicine. He's a diplomat at the American College of Veterinary Preventative Medicine and serves on their executive board. I apologize, everybody. I'm all tongue-tied today. Additionally, he is an alternate delegate for Illinois to the AVMA House of Delegates. He is a 2009 graduate of University of Wisconsin College of Veterinary Medicine and received an MPH from Yale University in 2011. He graduated with his BA in biology from Colby College in 2004. Dr. Duncan and Dr. Sander, I'll let you handle it from here.
Great. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining this webinar today. And really, our goal today is to kind of introduce the new SSIG that is starting up, which Will is going to talk about in the second half of this talk. But of course, framing this a little bit in the context of sustainability, what it is, how does it relate to climate change and health. So next slide. Just before we begin, we wanted to put this slide up here to encourage you all to use the chat. In the second half of the presentation, we're going to talk a little bit more about sort of what preventative medicine veterinarians specifically can do within this space, addressing climate change and other sustainability issues. So we'd really be interested in hearing how other people are talking about sustainability and talking about actions that we can all take within the college. So to begin today's talk, I'm going to give a bit of an overview of climate change and the associated diseases in animals that we see and how this really mirrors work that's being done in public health. We're going to transition into the broader context of sustainability. And then, as I mentioned before, what the role of veterinarians and more specifically preventative medicine veterinarians is within this space. And finally, how does this relate to our college and what can we do within our special interest group? So I'm sure everyone's seen this quote before from the Lancet. Next slide. This is actually from an article back in 2009. And it was back then that our public health colleagues declared climate change to be the greatest global health threat of the 21st century. And so for the first half of this presentation, I want to talk a little bit about what we've done sort of in veterinary medicine. And I use we as like kind of the royal we as our animal health professionals college, as we think about how we fit in and what the climate change, what this means for the health of animals. So on the next slide here, one of the things that I've spent a lot of time thinking about over these last few years, and I'll say I work as an educator, as does Will, and a lot of this, my motivation comes from young people, comes from our future veterinarians that are really interested in what they can do in this space and concerned about this problem. But it's almost overwhelming how many different ways climate change can affect all of our different species and all of the geographic areas that we live. And as was mentioned at the beginning, I wear two hats. I'm a pathologist, but also an epidemiologist. And when I think about how we classify disease, as a pathologist, we often think about things like what organ system and what is the etiology or what is the pathogenesis of that disease. So we kind of have a classification system in place, much like epidemiologists similarly have a classification scheme. So thinking about which species, which geographic region, and what particular risk factors or cohorts are impacted. But what we've really come to realize is that climate change impacts all diseases across all species, all organ systems, and all parts of the world. But it does look a little bit different. People talk often about climate change being, the great amplifier of existing diseases. And if you move on to the next slide, thanks, Will. This is really the framework that our public health professionals have been talking about it. So I just leave these in as reference. The image on the left is from the US Global Change Research Program from big work that they published in 2016 about climate change and human health. And on the right, we have the more recent IPCC report that really highlights how the effects of climate change are basically moderated or modified by both the environment that people reside in, as well as our social systems and support systems that we have for those particular populations. And for everybody on this call, I think the idea of social and environmental determinants of health is not new. And embedding sort of the work that we do and what we study in animals within these physical and social contexts is really important. So on this next slide, this is kind of a modified or sort of a simplified version of some of the work that's been done in human health, kind of to animal health, which is really the same idea of embedding the exposure pathways within the physical and social determinants of health. And this idea of exposure pathways is really how disease has been classified in human health, and I think makes a lot of sense. I'm going to work through some of these about the corollaries that we have in animal health and how we would argue that this is probably a good framework to go forward so we can have some unified language as we talk about the animal health impacts of climate. And I just want to point out here as I go through these 7 different exposure pathways, obviously some are pretty obvious, the physical environmental conditions. So here in Fort Collins, I don't really worry so much about global sea level rise on a day-to-day basis. But as we were talking about in the waiting room before this call, it was a year ago right now that we experienced these crazy wildfires here in Colorado at a weird time of year that affected urban areas. So, that's the kind of physical environmental condition where you are that really matters. But also, I think it's really important to highlight these social environmental conditions, right? So not everybody has the means and ability to protect themselves from these climate harms. And that's something that's so important for us as a preventative medicine community, because we know that climate change affects people and their animals that are more vulnerable to already existing threats. So whether that's financial, whether that's gender related, whether that's race. So we have all of these really important social determinants of health. And in many cases, climate change just amplifies those inequities. So just to go through these sort of 7 exposure pathways, we'll start with increasing temperature. Next slide. Now, this one's kind of a no-brainer, I think, for veterinarians. This is just, I pulled this from a pretty recent publication just talking about heat stress in cattle, right? So we know that most animals kind of have this thermal neutral zone or a comfort zone. And when they get outside of that, really either direction, then we experience heat stress and cold stress, and that there's a number of physical manifestations or disease conditions that are associated with both. And on the next slide, we can see this is from the same article, and where we're really seeing this or where we're measuring this is often in outputs of production animals. So with the exception of kind of extreme, frostbite kind of situation or heat exhaustion or hyperthermia, we also know that even within sort of more subtle temperature gradients or outside of that thermoneutral zone, we see changes in production. And that's really important because a lot of us wear the hat of production animal medicine, where this ties to not only economics of the producer, but also in some cases welfare. But those sort of less recognized impacts of elevated temperatures, and here we're not talking about extreme weather, but just this gradual, the global warming. Another big one is on airway. And so the pathogenesis of this ultimately is because hot and humid air leads to bronchoconstriction. And for those that already experience these chronic respiratory diseases, most notably things like COPD, that is sort of exasperates any underlying condition. There's also a strong relationship between temperature and pollution. So we know not only does elevated temperature result in the production of different pollutants like ground level ozone, but also it's kind of a double hit, right, on the respiratory system. So what does this mean in veterinary medicine? I think we have a few examples that are kind of classic species or even geographic areas where we know we have a lot of underlying illness. So, our COPD example is the horse, and our brachycephalic dogs. There's now literature to show that these are at-risk animals during heat events. Next slide. The other, and perhaps a little bit less recognized system that's impacted by elevated temperature is the cardiovascular system. And the pathogenesis of this is really that this warming leads to an upregulation of systemic inflammation and ultimately heart disease. Now, the veterinarian in me, the veterinary pathologist in me will happily point out that sort of the chronic plague of heart disease in humans, which is largely mediated through atherosclerosis, is certainly less common in animals. And whether that's age-related or species differences, we can go down that road later. But we do have some species that are prone to atherosclerosis. And I would also argue that these are the types of things we may not really be doing surveillance for. The other way that temperature increases heart-associated illness is that it makes it much harder to treat any cardiovascular disease because often this has to do with water balance and also thermoregulation. So again, I think we know that we have some species, this is a hypothyroid dog, for example, in this photo, African gray parrots. But this pathogenesis, just by virtue of corollary between human and animal pathophysiology, I think is something to be aware of. And the last one for heat-associated illness or system that we often think of as kidney. So this is actually kind of interesting. A lot of the pathogenesis relates really to dehydration, and oftentimes renal disease is seen more frequently in like outdoor workers and farm laborers. And ultimately, this has to do with things like kidney stones, bladder stones, but there is also now documented it's called a heat stress nephropathy, which is basically attributed to climate change. This is a human condition at this point, but I think there's a number of vet med corollaries like cats, right? I mean, there's a world of research on chronic kidney disease in cats that already are sensitive to a lot of the renal disease, and it is ultimately kind of a chronic kidney disease syndrome. So what is it doing? Exasperating existing renal disease? We don't really know. All right, the next one is air quality. And this next photo here, this is actually I was fortunate to go to COP in Egypt, and this is actually the booth of the World Health Organization. And as you walk into the booth of the WHO, there's a sign that says, "The price of climate change will be paid by our lungs." And that's because the magnitude of disease that can be attributed to air pollution due to climate change is so massive. And I'm sure many of you have seen a lot of these reports in the human health literature. So on the next slide, I just have a couple of examples. Where's this coming from? A big part of this is wildfire and wildfire smoke, for sure. But we also just have a lot of like ground level ozone that I already mentioned. On the right-hand side, this is hot news here in Fort Collins. Our air quality, we've been down-regulated to basically being ranked as severe here on the Front Range, where people think, Colorado, Rocky Mountain High and beautiful blue skies. But this is because of, it's because of many reasons, but ultimately the ground level ozone. So air pollution, next slide, obviously impacts largely the lungs, but also cardiovascular system. And in cattle or in animals, we're certainly seeing this. And the more we look, the more we find. This is an article that came out of some work done here at CSU, where, see previous point about our high air pollution, we basically looked to see if there was an association between regional air pollution and production, and found that not only did we have increased somatic cell counts, but also decreased production that could be explained by by regional air pollution. And this actually modifies the very well-established relationship between temperature and production in cattle. So it's, kind of the main conclusion of this work was that we need to start measuring pollution, and we need to start factoring this into our models when we're thinking about these environmental drivers to production. Next slide here, some of the other work that we've been doing. This is work in progress by one of our MPH students, but we asked the question of, it's so hard to measure, impacts, subtle impacts. So what's an animal species where we have huge amounts of sort of performance data that we could aggregate together and look at air pollution? And so we looked at animal athletes, of which the racehorse, thoroughbred racehorse, is obviously a leader. So we analyzed 10 years worth of racehorse performance data and air pollution data and looked for a cut point. And ultimately, it's the same cut point, or pretty much around the same cut point of particulate matter in the air, where you see this difference between horses, the speed in horses. So there's a statistically significant difference between the racehorse speed across all distances, whether or not they run at high PM 2.5 values or below PM 2.5 values. So I think there's a lot of other animal systems where we could start to look at the impacts of pollution in ways that perhaps have not been previously measured. And here's just a couple of examples to my previous point. I'm always a little bit surprised at some of the things that people have already found. So for example, this is an article from in Veterinary Ophthalmology recently correlating the corneal ulcers with the air pollution, and which was specifically due to wildfires. And then one really, I think, kind of untapped area of research is actually on reproduction. So there is tons and mounting evidence on the human reproductive impacts associated with air pollution, how much can be attributed to pollution alone. And that is a huge deal. And that is a huge deal for us in production animal medicine as well. So I think that there's a lot of work still to be done in this space as well. All right, our next one is vector-borne disease. And I think that this college has certainly done a lot of work in this area. And I probably won't go into this in too much depth, but ultimately, this is a heartworm case from the necropsy floor. When I moved to Fort Collins, nobody told me to give my dog heartworm, but you sure do now. And so that's kind of the classic, right? We expect with vector-borne disease to see this range expansion of vectors, so diseases in new geographic areas. Another is temporal distribution, and we see a lot of this with parasites. So for example, animals that are able to go through multiple complete life cycles or parasite life cycles. So you end up with a different parasite burden. There's been some really interesting work done in that space up in the Arctic specifically. So we see also things like really different disease dynamics. So there's some examples where, vectors can prey on different hosts, so you can sort of have some changes in epidemiology. And ultimately, this has led to many examples where we have these kind of emerging or re-emerging diseases in areas where they were not previously or had been controlled and can no longer be successfully controlled. So on the next slide, we just have sort of your classic example of, this is an article on a review article about different tick disease vectors in North America. And so on the left-hand side, you have the lovely colorful gradient maps of our temperature that is warming, which correlates really nicely with the range expansion of several different tick species that can carry diseases. For the interest of time, we'll probably just skip on here. But I do want to highlight the substantial economic concern that is associated with these vector shifts. So this is just some data from when blue tongue expanded its range. Blue tongue 8 made it into the Netherlands. And so this is the Netherlands. Like if you compare their agricultural system to the US agricultural system, it talks about these indirect and direct costs on the Dutch farming industry back when BTV 8 made it into the country. And these are huge, huge amounts of money. So I think not only from the sort of direct morbidity and mortality, there's a lot of indirect effects that are already seen and are predicted to increase under warming scenarios. The next one is water-associated health impacts. And this too is fairly kind of complex and nuanced, and could certainly be a series of talks on its own. But I tend to think about this in broad brushstrokes. So we have things like infectious diseases. Well, if you have warm water, then this facilitates growth of many different things, and sometimes things that can live in areas that didn't before. Everybody loves a good news story about deadly brain-eating amoebas, and here's one for you from, just recently. I feel like we see these now fairly frequently. Infectious diseases are also spread by changes in precipitation that lead to flooding, runoff, groundwater contamination, and also really challenging our public health infrastructure, like our entire sewage systems. And of course, not enough water is also a problem. So we were discussing this in the waiting room on the call, just, it's winter and who has appropriate snowpack and who does not. You probably don't go to a cocktail party where this does not come up, certainly not in Colorado. But drought can equally, not just from not having enough water, but it can also concentrate pathogens at particular sources or particular locations. And also as a result of animals that are mixing or increased mixing by bringing animals to different water sources that they perhaps didn't use. So there are many opportunities for the spread of infectious disease under these sort of water-associated impacts. Next slide. Toxins are obviously another one. Here are just kind of a couple of your big ones, right? So blue-green algae, another story that we're all seeing far too often in the news is the example of dog swims in local pond, dog dies, or plural dogs die. This is a real topic of conversation here, and I'm sure everywhere that you all are calling in at. So there's freshwater toxic algae problems, but also marine. So this is your California sea lion and the classic hippocampal atrophy that we see with these guys who are exposed chronically to domoic acid. So I bring this in here because it's important to recognize that many of these toxins, in this case, algae, has both an acute, which is severe and concerning, but also some of these chronic impacts, right? So these chronic hippocampal atrophy cases, these are animals that may not forage, may not be as thrifty, these types of things. So we kind of have both the acute and long-term situation here. And finally, and I think this is the really unique area where veterinarians shine. This is a huge shout out to my aquatic colleagues, our aquatic colleagues. We need more veterinarians who work in the oceans, who work on things like coral, because these are the ones that really don't have a human corollary, right? Humans do not live underwater and therefore are not exposed. So the two biggies that I think of here in this space, first of all, ocean acidification and coral reef die-offs. I mean, I lectured this year, my climate change lecture this year to the vet students. I did the math, and I think there are some vet students who just started first year who statistically may still be alive when we lose all our coral reefs. That's a pretty big deal when you talk about those being entire ecosystems. And another really fascinating one is this temperature-dependent sex determination. So we see this this is a green sea turtle. I mean, if you end up with all female turtles, that's the end of a species, right? So these are really unique disease scenarios that we are seeing in marine systems or in any freshwater systems as well, that I think it really takes a veterinarian champion because MDs are not working in this space. Climate change in food, much like water, is really, really complex. On the next slide, this is kind of your Colleen's level of climate change in food. It kind of comes down to these big three things. We might not have enough food. So, and that I think in the veterinary space are thinking about things like pollinators, who's protecting our pollinators, and how much is food going to cost when we lose them. The cost associated with agricultural pests and also contamination and spoilage. And these are both toxins, but also infectious diseases in this space. We may produce some food, but we might not be able to get it. Poverty and conflict, these are often this is often driven by lack of access to needs for daily living. Extreme weather events can disrupt infrastructure that it takes to get food to people, all of those types of things. And finally, the quality of the food in the end. So infectious disease, contaminants, like I mentioned previously, but there's some fascinating work that's been done about the nutritional quality of plants grown under different carbon situations. Yes, absolutely. In some cases, some crops will be produced in more prolific under warming scenarios, but ultimately there's some really concerning data about the nutritional quality, especially about micro and macronutrients. Extreme weather and disasters. This is kind of the one that we all think of. I think that most of the public thinks about too. And you just have to look to the news to find examples of all these different types of things. I'm not going to talk about this in any more depth because I think that we all have some of these in our local area, and they look a little bit different. But suffice to say, first of all, not all disasters are driven by climate change, but a heck of a lot of them are. And ultimately, we are going to get more frequent, unusual weather events like this. And on the next slide, I just put as a reminder, the AVMA has recognized this too, and I'm really excited about, the recognition that and the acknowledgement about the importance of preparing our profession to be responders to these disasters. And the final exposure pathway. So in human health, it's called mental health. So the mental health impacts of climate change. I think for the sake of animals, we don't assess the mental health of our animals, but on the next slide here, what we do talk about is welfare. And this is a poster actually from Veterinarians for Climate Action. This is the veterinary climate group out of Australia. And they have really framed a lot of their messaging around welfare. And if you think of even sort of the most core or simplified, talked about 5 freedoms, climate change has the potential to disrupt all of these, right? Freedom from hunger and thirst, I've talked about this, discomfort, pain, injury, that's what happens in natural disasters, all of these types of things. But on the next slide, I would argue that there are other sort of welfare issues, and these tie into mental health issues for our own profession. So this is just a couple of articles. I'm sure nobody missed the terrible fires that happened in Australia. And obviously vets really stepped up into that space to care for a lot of their, charismatic megafauna as well as everything else. And then the next is work that they did that really talked about what that did to the mental health of veterinary professionals who were responders in that space, right? So that's actually hard on our own profession. And my final slide here is actually from an article that was published, and I'm happy to share this reference if others don't have it. But this was a veterinary student who I worked with who surveyed, thanks to any of you who took the surveyed veterinarians about what they know, don't know, and want to know, and what they're concerned about when it comes to climate change. And in this kind of open text box about what are some other impacts that are associated with climate change, this is just one of the quotes, which is that this person was concerned about the mental impacts on veterinarians as well, who are concerned about wildlife and other animals and habitat destruction. But we received many of these where our veterinary population is responding that they are concerned for their own health, mental health and well-being, and that this is a real stressful event. So I would argue that this mental health category that exists for humans kind of exists for us as a profession, as well as being expanded into animal welfare. And with that, I'll pass the torch over to Will.
Thanks, Colleen. Appreciate it. I think, we obviously just focused a lot on the climate change aspect and the pathways to get to that. And sustainability certainly interlinks a lot with that component too. But there are other aspects of sustainability as well. And thus the question we asked at the beginning of this presentation, right, about how it impacts you and your jobs. And I appreciate the contributions we've seen so far. So, what is sustainability and what's kind of the role of veterinary professionals, right? So as somebody already mentioned, Julia mentioned that, talking about the 3 pillars, right? And it's not just about the ecological side, but it's also about the social and economic health of current and future generations. And generally, this is framed kind of in the human context, right? We all know that Earth is likely going to be around no matter what our species does to it in some form or fashion, but will our species be around, and will it be a place we want to be in at the same time? And so the UN, many of you are familiar with the UN's Millennium Development Goals that were set up back in 2000. In 2015, they revisited that as that term limit for the Millennium Development Goals expired, and they came up with the Sustainability Development Goals, or the SDGs. So these are those 17 SDGs here. And you can see that if you think about these at all in any broad context, a lot of them overlap with the veterinary profession. And so, this idea of the 3-legged stool is critical to this, and thinking about what do we need to think about within sustainability, right? And most of us, including myself, think about the environmental aspect, but we have to think about what services and functionality go into the facts of social and economic influences that will keep our generation and the vet students sitting in our classrooms right now that will be here when some of these things fully come into effect, come into place. And so the Vet Sustain group in the United Kingdom developed their own veterinary sustainability goals, 6 of them here. And so we've mapped those here with sustainability development goals from the UN to see where that overlap fits into place, right? So for the Vet Sustain goals, they're talking about a diverse and abundant wildlife. We're talking about a good life for animals, right? Getting back to those 5 freedoms that we mentioned earlier. The net zero warming aspect, health and happiness, and this isn't about the animals necessarily, but it's also about us as a profession too. A no waste society and enough clean water for all. And so you can see a lot of these sustainability development goals, the UN goals, fit nicely underneath these 6 vet goals. So what can veterinarians do, right? Obviously, the first one and the foremost is protecting animal health, and this can be at the individual clinical level, certainly, but also population health, as many of us are involved in production and preventive medicine. It can also be, as we alluded to earlier, emergency response too, right? Protecting animal health in that regard, whether that's proactive plans in place or reactive plans after the emergency comes in place, and mitigating and adapting. We can also lead by example, right? And this is an area where our profession, unfortunately, has been a little behind the 8 ball in trying to respond to some of these sustainability challenges compared to some of our other health colleagues out there. But it's a place where we have sufficient knowledge and resources to jump into and be a key player. We can communicate, and this can be communicating to our clients, it could be communicating to our community, it could be communicating to policymakers as well. And then leading and at least participating in team building and collaboration, right? We talk about the One Health concept quite frequently in our profession, and this is a key place where we can be in that One Health interface and add to collaborations that are already going on. Education can be informal education to very formalized education, right? And we have the ability, we're good at interfacing with all of our human colleagues all the time and our clients all the time, that we could certainly be these leaders in education. Advocating for policy, again, whether that's policies within our profession, policies at the community or state level, or even at the national or potentially even the international level, right? Again, these are places where we can interface and interject our veterinary and public health expertise. And then conducting and participating in research on climate smart practices, on sector specific and our sectoral research enterprises, right? Or even pressing for certain things like comprehensive AVMA policy on sustainability, right? These are all areas where we can look at as a profession. And so not too long ago, this past fall, we stood up a nonprofit called Veterinary Sustainability Alliance. So we've mentioned already in this presentation, a group out of Australia and a group out of the United Kingdom. We felt like North America was a little bit missing from that objective. And so we're getting this moving here with trying to be a place to collaborate and coalesce some of these educational resources and ability to share and communicate what's going on to better the entire profession. And so here's some information if you're interested in this. This is still in the very nascent stages at this point, but we do have a Facebook page and a website as well if you're interested, and these QR codes will take you there. One thing I think it's really important to highlight, especially within our college here with ACVPM, is this younger generation interest, right? How do we think about harnessing that as we continue to realize how important preventive medicine is and make sure the next generation understands that as well? And so several studies have pointed out that Generation Z is more green and sustainability oriented and tech savvy as well. So how do we play into those aspects, right? Some of the survey work that's been done by Colleen has looked at veterinary teaching hospitals, and they generally want additional environmental sustainability initiatives or efforts. And either it's a lack of resources or prioritization that's held that up. 2/3 of pet owners also value vets knowing animal impacts of climate change, right? And it's significantly greater amount in younger generations of pet owners who want their veterinarians to know something about climate change and the impact on pet health. And greater than 50% of those clients would pay more for a green practice where it's identified as such, right? And certainly our veterinary students really like this idea of understanding how we can be leaders in this field, environmental sustainability, and help drive the profession down this road. So I think this is a great aspect to focus on and think about moving forward. And think about those vet sustain goals, those 6 vet sustain goals I highlighted earlier, how they overlap with the UN SDGs. Well, they also overlap with our core ACVPM areas, right? So these are the 6 areas that are highlighted in Article 2 of our Constitution that talk about, what we should be as preventive veterinarians, right? And you can see there's a lot of green on this slide, right? There's a lot of overlap with these vet sustain goals, which makes an intuitive sense. But I think it's nice to have this visualization to think about, where do we fit? Well, we fit in a lot of these spots, and a lot of you have contributed already in the chat thinking about this too within your own jobs. Same thing with our ACVPM test areas as well. So we have 5 test areas, right, that we've had all of us who are diplomats have gone through with the 2-day test to get to, and there's a lot of blue on the screen again of that overlap. So it's inherent in what we have to do to become experts in this field is knowing a great deal about what goes into sustainability. And so I want to turn it over to a couple other folks who are part of our special interest group here, have been helping start this up here in the last few months to talk about some of their specific examples within their jobs. And so I'll turn over to Dr. Katie Stenroden first to talk about her work at CFSPH.
Hey there, can you hear me?
We can.
All right. Okay. Well, thanks, Colleen and Will, and thanks for having me. I'm Katie Stenroden, and I work with the Center for Food Security and Public Health at Iowa State University. And I wanted to tell you about 2 overlapping projects that we've been working on over the past 2 years in the sustainably raised food regenerative agriculture space. And they involve working with non-conventional farmers and veterinarians. So there's 2 major goals in these overlapping projects, and big picture, it's we want to determine what small scale and non-conventional farmers are doing for disease prevention, and then create tools and materials to meet the gaps that we identify. This audience that we're talking about, these non-conventional farmers, is kind of big and confusing, and they include USDA certified organic producers, and these are people who jump through all the hoops and carry that organic label that you see at the grocery store on your meat and your eggs and your milk. And it also includes alternative livestock producers, who are kind of a big, wide, crazy group. So they might prohibit one of the above things. They might prohibit antibiotics or hormones or GMOs, but they don't jump through all the hoops that the organic producers do. There's also farmers who have land-based restrictions that are greater than USDA certified organic, such as 100% grass-fed or free-range designations. And then there's also welfare-based certifications that some of these producers do. And so we're trying to create materials for as best we can for all that meets the needs of many of these different kinds of non-conventional livestock producers. The second goal the major goal that we have is to is to improve the relationship between veterinarians and non-conventional livestock producers. It hasn't always been a happy and a close relationship. And so we're developing training for veterinarians about non-conventional agriculture and their potential role in it. And we hope that'll benefit both the farmers and rural veterinarians. But really, it's really more than just rural veterinarians. I have to say that, because raising, organic and alternative meat and eggs and poultry and dairy is becoming more peri-urban and urban all the time, every day. As demand for locally produced food and sustainable food increases. I've worked in some small animal clinics where I saw chickens and pigs on occasion, and that was 20 years ago. And so I have a feeling that there's more urban practices that are seeing some of these livestock species and would benefit from this training as well. So you can see our website there, and we have some outreach, and that includes that website. We have a weekly blog, Facebook page, and we're trying to engage both farmers and veterinarians. I've got 2 students working for me right now. They're undergraduates at Iowa State, and they are amazing. One of them wants to go into regenerative agriculture. The other one wants to be a dairy geneticist. And it's really exciting to see how excited they get about this. So we created a continuing education course for vets and extension and vet techs that came out last summer. And we are in the process of creating 6 more free CE courses that'll be coming out at late spring this 2023. And we're going to have more information on that. And that'll include disease prevention, organic rules and regulations, treatments, practice management, client communication, all those things. So I don't know about you, but I learned nothing. I only learned about conventional agriculture in vet school, and from discussions with vet students currently and recent graduates, most of them aren't learning anything about it. So it's, we're trying to expand on that, and all these materials are going to be open source once we get them all put up, so it'll be available to anyone and everyone. I just wanted to quickly mention something about the funding. Both of the grants that we got were USDA grants from different sections or different programs. Excuse me. And neither of the grants had anything in them that had to do with organic or alternative or sustainable or climate change or any ideas even associated with that. So they talked about potential audiences for their grants as underserved populations and then rural veterinary practice enhancement. So, we use the organic and alternative food production as kind of a way to get in and a way to get these grants. So you're not always going to be able to find funding that is where you think it's going to be, I guess was my point there. So visit our website and, subscribe and like us, because USDA will love that, and we'll spread the word some more. So thanks, and thanks for the ability to let you all know about this.
Thanks, Katie. And then Dr. Danielle Vutke is also sort of some slides too for National Park Service. I think you're on the phone. Can you hear us?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. I am parked on the side of the road in northeastern Wyoming to try and get signal. So I apologize if my audio is not ideal. I want to talk a little bit today about, really more my journey. You've already gotten an excellent kind of survey of all the opportunities that are out there. But I found myself really paralyzed in figuring out, well, great, I'm really concerned about this. I want to do something about this, but where is my place? How do I actually contribute? Particularly because my job is this one specific thing, or I work in this one specific area, or I have this one specific degree. And so what I want to show and highlight today is that there are so many opportunities. The important thing is that you do something where you are as soon as possible. So I've been working in the National Park Service, leading the One Health program since 2012. And in 2015, I was leading response to several different totally unprecedented zoonotic disease outbreaks that were all linked or had very clear climate change responses. So they were increasing in number and severity because of climate change. And I was finding myself really burnt out, in part because number one, it felt like we were rearranging proverbial deck chairs on the Titanic, because I saw that climate change was the greatest public health threat of the century, and we were diverting most of our public health dollars to these infectious diseases, which, admittedly is where the funding for my position came from and the bread and butter of my position. But it was startling to me that air pollution kills 3 times more people than COVID-19 has killed. And this is every single year, air pollution kills 3 times more people than COVID-19 has killed since it arose in 2019. And this is all because of fossil fuel, combustion of fossil fuels. So this is, this absolutely unprecedented impact that we really aren't addressing very much as a public health community. And second, even when we are looking at those infectious diseases, many, if not most of them, have some implication, some change, are influenced in some way, shape, or form by either climate change or biodiversity loss. And so it felt to me, to be very futile, to be working and focusing explicitly on these infectious diseases that I still found very intellectually stimulating and rewarding. But I really got into this profession to try and make the greatest difference I possibly could. So I thought to myself, I've got two options. One, I can quit my job and go picket, similar to Greta Thunberg, and really try and make a difference where I want to be. Or, since I'm not a very brave person, I could try and make some small effort where I was in my current position with my, salary and pension in place. And so I obviously chose the latter. And that started out by doing, essentially, I thought, hey, we could do a carbon inventory for my specific office and my specific program. And as I think you'll find, if you haven't already, when you start working on climate change, when you start working on biodiversity loss, even though it feels scary, even though it feels like, this overwhelming problem and that it's not kosher to talk about this, you will find that there is an absolute overwhelming outpouring of people that want to get involved, people that feel the same way that you do. There's an amazing growing body of literature that shows that pluralistic ignorance is what is inhibiting our action on climate change. Pluralistic ignorance is essentially the idea that even though everyone feels the same way, everyone assumes everyone else feels differently. The amount of mis and disinformation that is out there around climate change means that the social norm is to not talk about it, that it's scary. You never know what other people are going to feel, even though studies show the vast majority of individuals, even in this country, are very concerned about climate change, more than 75% of Americans. However, depending on the study, less than a quarter to a third of Americans are willing to talk about it, simply because we think we're the only ones that feel that way. When I started doing that carbon inventory for my office, I very quickly learned that really, it's especially in the National Park Service, an even greater majority of the public, of the people that I was working with, that wanted to do something about this. And so fortunately, I learned a really important lesson there, that while the individual actions you are working on may feel really small, like they're not making that big of an impact, like me driving to Central South Dakota today instead of flying there for work, in the end, the conversations that you start are what change the social norms that lead to policy changes. And that's where really the most work can be done. So no matter how small the action is, no matter how insignificant you may feel it is, doing it, especially if it's visible, is critically important, because that is how those pebbles start rolling down the hill to lead to that avalanche of social change that we need for real climate action. So as a result of these carbon inventories, conversations, and other activities that started in the fall of 2019, we started a climate and equity strategy for the National Park Service that was housed in the Office of Public Health, and I was leading this program. Obviously, COVID-19, occurring at that same time, kind of sidetracked our efforts, and so it took us longer to get off the ground. But we were really, really fortunate to have that time to try out some smaller efforts to really crystallize where we saw the biggest opportunity for us to make a difference. And those were in these three areas: education and outreach, policy, and kind of our different programming, and then operations. And while we don't have a lot of time to go through much of these, I'm happy to share our specific strategy and plan with you. Overwhelmingly, we have been able to use the recognition and trust that the National Park Service has to get public conversations started around the importance of climate change to influence human health and the importance of us taking action. And at the end of the day, that's the most important message I have today. If you remember nothing else, there's really compelling messages that find that, number one, when there are trusted messengers, and scientists, veterinarians, and healthcare professionals are some of the most, if not the most trusted professions, that are willing to start conversations, we can change social norms faster. And secondly, and this is probably the most important aspect, that messages about the health impacts of climate change, whether it's to humans or their pets, and the specific benefits that we will see as a society by transitioning to clean energy, by addressing the climate change problem, are so substantial that they can change social norms, support for policy for climate action faster than any other issue, than any other conversation. And it's one of the only topics and messages that allows us to get to those very, very small percentages, less than 19% of Americans that consider themselves in the climate deniers or doubtful categories. So in the end, do what you can where you are and talk about it. Those are the most important things that we can do. And no matter what agency you work for, there's always opportunities for that. And I really thank Will and Colleen for organizing this seminar today. And I'm always happy to talk with folks more about these efforts and more opportunities to partner if this is of interest. Thank you.
Thanks, Danielle. Appreciate you pulling off the side of the road too, and not actively driving. That's really key. And you found cell service. That's fantastic. Thank you again for contributing, both you and Katie. So I wanted to, the last couple slides here, talk briefly about some of you provide some great examples about working in local public health departments and thinking about equity and about severity of storms, thinking about how parasite burdens that are increasing because overwintering, there's not an issue as far as kill off there. Think about workers teleworking and how that might cut down on environmental impacts while providing more flexibility, and that change we've gone through in the last couple of years with COVID. So I appreciate some of these examples, and think about heat stress with livestock transport. And so I think some of these things that we're doing in our jobs currently, or thinking about currently, could apply certainly very well to a special interest group within our college. And so that's where we get into the SSIG, or the Sustainability Special Interest Group. But first, I think it would behoove everybody to make sure we all know that we have special interest groups in ACVPM. And so this was stood up a few years ago. Dr. Barbara Jones kind of took the lead on this, and she's now our current president for ACVPM. And she tried to push forward, places for us to have discussions about certain special interest areas. And so for those of you who are diplomats and maybe don't know that this exists on our current website, here's our ACVPM webpage, just a partial screenshot of it. And once you sign in, you can click on diplomats, or hover your mouse over diplomats, and there's a drop down then, and you'll see this wonderful list of different places you can go, read about all the policies and SOPs and things we have in place. But you can also look at the special interest groups here. You can see circled here at the bottom. Once you click on that page, you'll be taken to this. And so right now we have 6 special interest groups, sustainability being the newest one created. But all of these have places where we have folks sign up for it, and we certainly use cheerleaders for it as well. But I want to talk about the Sustainability Special Interest Group here. And so this was just launched this past summer. Dr. Marguerite Papuano is our 5th member here as well, who's helped us out and kind of really spearheading this, along with Katie, Danielle, Colleen, and myself. And we have an active sign-up sheet via Google Sheets or Microsoft Office, I think. But either way, you can go to this QR code here and sign up if you're interested in being part of this SSIG. You can also put your name into the website through the ACVPM Special Interest Group website, and we can collect it there. And we're hopeful this is going to be a platform to discuss sustainability, right? But it's wide open. Sustainability is pretty wide and a lot of different possibilities. So if you're engaged in the field of sustainability, if you're passionate about the environment, or you're new to the idea and want to learn more, this might be the place for you. And so right now we have a little over 20 diplomats, I think, signed up right now. But we're hopeful to have our first formal organizational meeting later this month. And so if any of you are interested, now is a great time to get involved, and hopefully plenty of opportunities moving forward. And thinking about some of the ways that preventive medicine veterinarians specifically can be involved in sustainability, we think about education, right? Developing some sort of resource library, or potentially thinking about a conference around this specific topic. Research, as I mentioned earlier, having better science around the mitigation, adaptation, and sustainability initiatives that are out there adds to that growing weight of evidence that's already being produced. We're also really interested, I think, in potentially serving other specialty colleges, both within the veterinary profession, but also outside of it too, and thinking about what's going on out there and how can we potentially jump in and help out. Thinking about specialty colleges like the surgeons and how are they dealing with PPE and things like that, or our anesthesiologists and anesthetic gas waste, for example, right? Also advocacy to a certain extent, right? How can we advocate for climate-friendly policies, a comprehensive AVMA policy, for example, and then engaging, the health sectors writ large, right? So thinking about how can we engage with our physician counterparts, our nurses, our dentists, how can we reach out to that? So we'd welcome other thoughts, and I know we've had some good comments in the chat so far. We'd welcome additional thoughts as well, or additional questions. And with that, we want to say thanks for all of you attending. We have a great turnout here with almost 150 of you here today. That's fantastic. This is the QR code at the top here for signing up for the SSIG if you're interested. And then the bottom QR codes for the Veterinary Sustainability Alliance. And so with that, happy to try and answer any questions that have been populated in the chat or anything else at this point.
And yeah, hopefully those of you that have enjoyed or found this topic interesting and would be interested in thinking about what our college could do. I will say that it has reinvigorated sort of the preventative medicine story within veterinary students, at least at CSU. And I think that we have the potential to be really great leaders in this space. Our college really kind of covers this environmental domain. So I'm really excited that everybody was able to join today.
So there's one question here, Steve, from Doug Lewis about what the difference is between the One Health Special Interest Group and Sustainability Special Interest Group. I think that's a good question. The One Health Special Interest Group was to talk about anything under the One Health umbrella. Sustainability is a little bit more narrow than that. And I will say none of the special interest groups to date have really taken off per se either. So I think there could be aspects where we funnel off to a One Health aspect, and sustainability might be in its own lane. So I think there's room for kind of defining where that falls.
Well, excellent presentation. I definitely want to thank our speakers. Very exciting topic, and I think will generate some activity within our special interest group within the ACVPM. I will turn it over now to Dr. Kaylee Pettit for some closing comments.
Well, first off, thank you for the wonderful presentation. It was very enlightening. And just a shameless plug to everyone out there. If you or anyone you know has a topic that would be good for this, for these webinars, please reach out to us either through email or online through the submission. And we are, because we are always looking for new topics to bring information to our group. Thank you very much.